Major funding for Field of Lost Shoes, the Battle of Newmarket, is provided by Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. VMI is proud to support WVPT Public Television. Additional funding for Living in Virginia is provided by CFW Intellos and 81.
Coming up, 250 young Virginians fighting together for the first time. A Civil War story about friendship, duty, and love of country.
If I die, I want to be buried back home.
Living in Virginia takes you back to 1864 and the last major Confederate victory in the Shenandoah Valley. Field of Lost Shoes, a dramatic special, coming up next.
"1909 was a good year to work the land in Virginia. Warm weather arrived in March, and springtime saw plenty of rain. In the Shenandoah Valley that year, an elderly woman named Eliza Klein-Dinst Krim, Liddy Krim, sat down at her desk and wrote a letter about a distant memory.
My dear friend, I want to tell you something about the Battle of Newmarket. I hope it will be of interest to you. The day of the battle, I stood on the doorstep. My little brother called me to come and look at the fine soldiers coming down Shirley's Hill. For the first time, I saw the Virginia Military Cadets. They looked so nice and trim as they ran down the hill. Just then, a terrible shell exploded right in front of the line as they came and knocked a terrible gap in the ranks. They just ran together, elbow to elbow, in an instant and closed up so beautifully. I can see it now. I will never forget these brave boy soldiers as they ran down the hill to victory and death.
In 1864, I was a 24-year-old journalist writing for the Baltimore American. That was more than 55 years ago. I was in the Valley of Virginia that spring, Stonewall's Valley. Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, the general whose campaign there in 1862 shocked the North and delighted the young Confederacy. The Battle of Newmarket. It was the Confederates' last major victory in the Shenandoah Valley, their last real moment of euphoria there, and the moment when Virginians showered their affection on VMI's young cadets. "1864 marked an election year for President Lincoln. It was the third full year of war between the Union and Confederacy. Both sides were growing weary of the conflict. That spring, the Union Army had a new general-in-chief, Ulysses S. Grant, who knew that if the Federals were to win the war, they would have to apply overwhelming pressure on the South. Grant ordered General Sherman to strike Confederate troops in Georgia. And in Virginia, he had his eye on destroying the Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by Robert E. Lee. In the western part of the state, Grant ordered Major General Franz Sigel to move his troops south through the Shenandoah Valley and take control of Staunton, a city of vital importance to Richmond. Staunton protected General Lee's left flank. Franz Sigel was not the only new commander in the western part of Virginia. The Confederates had a new commander, too, Major General John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. Breckinridge was the youngest vice president in American history, just 35 when he was elected to serve under President James Buchanan in 1856. 4 years later, Breckinridge finished second to Abraham Lincoln in the race for president. When he took over the command of the Department of Western Virginia in March 1864, his forces amounted to just a fraction of what Sigel had. But his department also included the Virginia Military Institute, the West Point of the South. The institute was established in 1839. It had been a state arsenal for years. Its reputation grew after the war broke out. Many of the Confederacy's top officers had graduated from the institute or taught there, like Stonewall Jackson. In 1861, VMI Cadets drilled the Confederacy's new recruits in Richmond. A year later, they marched with Jackson during his McDowell campaign in the western part of the state. Graduates of VMI fought everywhere during the Civil War. As the conflict dragged on, the school's young cadets began itching for battle. And young they were. Most of the cadets were under 18, and some were as young as 15. Many were the sons of Virginia's most prominent families. Thomas Jefferson's great-grandnephew, Thomas Garland Jefferson, was a private in VMI's Company B. Lloyd Washington, a descendant of George Washington, was also in Company B. John Wise, the son of a former governor of Virginia, was a corporal in VMI's Company D. Among the Corps of Cadets was a 19-year-old private named Jacqueline B. Stannard. His family called him Bev, short for Beverly, but his classmates called him Jack. Another cadet, 19-year-old Moses Ezekiel, the Institute's first Jewish cadet, grew up in Richmond. Ezekiel had 13 brothers and sisters. As a child, he dreamt of becoming an artist, not a soldier. May 1st in 1864 was a Sunday, and Sigel's troops were breaking camp in Martinsburg, in present-day West Virginia. At noon, his army began marching south toward Winchester. Sigel's men knew that there would soon be a fight in the valley. Many of them were disheartened, including Colonel Strother.
On the road to Winchester, I saw what war had done to Virginia. The country was a picture of desolation. Although its hideousness was hidden by the budding of spring, everywhere I looked, I saw graves, bones, dead animals, and shattered equipment. We entered Winchester in column. The city looked gloomy and forlorn.
Halfway between Winchester and Staunton lay a bustling farm community. A crossroads of sorts, Newmarket, home to 700 residents and a small number of slaves. The town is located at the intersection of the main road that runs north and south through the Valley Pike, and the road that runs east and west through a gap in Massanutten Mountain to Luray.
Can you help me get that vice tight?
Among those who lived at Newmarket were Anderson Bushong and his father Jacob. The Bushong family farmed about 150 acres of land just north of town and operated a wheelwright shop where they made wagon wheels. Jacob's father Henry had cleared the land and established the farm decades before in the late 18th century. On May 10th, Sigel's troops were camped at Cedar Creek near Strasburg, 30 miles north of Newmarket. Breckinridge's men were camped in Staunton. It was a beautiful day in the valley. In Lexington, it was also a solemn anniversary. 1 year had passed since the death of General Jackson, the man Robert E. Lee called his right arm. That day, General Breckinridge also sent a letter to Francis Smith by courier.
Major General Smith. Sigel is moving up the valley. He was at Strasburg last night. I can't tell whether this is his destination. I would be glad to have your assistance at once with the cadets and the section of artillery.
Sigel's troops would soon march to Woodstock. But on May 10th, they remained in camp, relaxing and talking about Grant's campaign against Robert E. Lee on the other side of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Among the men encamped with Sigel's army was a surgeon from Ohio, Alexander Neal, who joined the Union Army in 1863. Neil wrote a letter home that day.
Dear friends, we arrived here last evening from Winchester having a very hot day's march, many of our men falling by the way from exhaustion. We are encamped in the most beautiful country I ever saw. Last night, a bushwhacker shot one of our men who was grazing his horse just outside of camp. One of our soldiers caught the murderer, and he'll be executed this afternoon by order of Major General Sigel. Our signal lights advise us of a great victory on the Rapidan River by Grant. Hope and pray it may be true.
At VMI that same evening, Breckinridge's courier arrived at the barracks and disappeared beneath the school's archway around 9 p.m. A short time later, the long roll echoed through their barracks.
Attention to orders. Headquarters, Virginia Military Institute, May 11th, 1864. General Orders number 18. Under the orders of Major General John C. Breckinridge, Commanding Department of West Virginia, the Corps of Cadets and a section of artillery will forthwith take up the line of march for Staunton, Virginia, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Scott Shipp. The cadets will carry with them 2 days' rations. Colonel Shipp, on arriving at Staunton, will report in person to Major General Breckinridge and await his further instructions. Parade dismissed.
As the companies were dismissed, the cadets cheered and walked briskly back to their rooms. That night, they barely had time to sleep. Under the watchful eye of George Washington, they made their preparations, readying the artillery, filling the caissons, and loading the wagons. The next morning, as the sun came up, there was still excitement in the barracks. Ezekiel and his classmates feasted on bacon, ham, and biscuits and talked about the march that was about to begin. At 8:30, they assembled at the Washington Arch. 2 days, 35 miles, they would soon meet with Breckinridge's men in Staunton.
Fall in. Corps attention. Shoulder arms.
The cadets were used to marching, but not 15 miles at a time. Private Tutwiler of Company D fell out several times to bathe his feet in the valley's cool waters, then ran to catch up with his roommate. VMI surgeon Robert Madison allowed Richard Turnstile, another foot-weary private, to rest his feet by riding the surgeon's horse for an hour. That afternoon, after traveling 18 miles, the cadets began setting up their camp. Private Stannard and his classmates had reached the town of Midway. At just about the time that the cadets began marching north from VMI, Sigel's men began marching south. Their immediate destination was Woodstock, and they marched along the Valley Pike. A cavalry detachment rode ahead of the infantry to protect Sigel's flanks. The general also sent out a second detachment under Colonel William Boyd of the 1st New York Cavalry. Boyd took 300 men. He left with instructions to secure the road at Newmarket, the one which ran through the gap in Massanutten Mountain. That afternoon, Sigel's infantry arrived in Woodstock, exhausted. But Sigel was elated. In taking Woodstock, he came across a week's worth of dispatches from General Breckinridge, which lay in the telegrapher's office. Now Sigel knew Breckinridge's plans. Sigel knew Breckinridge was heading north from Staunton with 4,000 men or more. He knew that Breckinridge worried he might move his army through the gap at Newmarket, then march east and aid Grant's army as it fought its way toward Richmond. Sigel thought about it for a bit, then decided to keep his troops in Woodstock. It would be safer here, he thought. Besides, his men needed drilling. On May 12th, Colonel Shipp and his Corps of Cadets rose early and marched north another 18 miles. By now, the rain was beginning to fall in the valley. At times, it fell heavily. But the gloomy weather didn't dampen the cadets' spirits. When the cadets arrived in Staunton, they passed the Augusta Female Seminary. That night,
Mother!
some of the cadets sneaked off to visit friends or relatives.
Harry, it's wonderful to see you. Oh.
Private Stannard and Corporal Wise went to the home of another classmate, Carrington Taylor. When they got there, Taylor's mother greeted them.
Come on in and rest yourselves. I'll make some tea.
Taylor's mother was surprised to see the boys in Staunton and learned for the first time how the boys had been called out to reinforce Breckinridge's men. She felt anxious at first, but she also felt a measure of relief that the boys had come to Staunton rather than joining Lee's troops on the other side of the Blue Ridge. As the boys enjoyed their meal, she asked them about life at the Institute. She also found out they expected to march north toward Winchester, perhaps as early as tomorrow. After the cadets had finished eating, Private Stannard stole away to another room to write a letter to his mother.
My darling mother, no doubt a letter written from this place will take you greatly by surprise. To relieve your anxiety, I will tell you what is happening. On Tuesday, we received a letter from General Breckinridge telling us to come immediately to Staunton. We arrived here this afternoon and will march to Harrisonburg in the morning, a distance of 26 miles. We hear the Yankees are coming up the valley with a force of 9,000. Our troops number about 5,000, or maybe a bit more. Please don't worry. General Breckinridge is an excellent commander.
Before they left, the boys filled their haversacks with food.
Goodbye, Mother.
Mrs. Taylor held her 18-year-old son tightly, refusing to let him go, then asked the other cadets to look after him until they were all back at the Institute.
Bye, Mother.
On May 13th, General Breckinridge set off for Harrisonburg with slightly over 5,000 Virginia troops, including the cadets. Breckinridge had fewer men than Sigel had, but he felt compelled to meet the Union general head-on. He didn't want Sigel to march his troops east by slipping through the gap at Newmarket. By this time, however, Sigel had begun facing some important difficulties of his own. In the weeks before the battle, his army was hounded by two groups of Confederate Rangers, one led by Colonel John Mosby, the other by Captain John McNeil. Then, less than a week before the battle, his cavalry suffered more serious losses due to the forces of General John Imboden, who commanded Confederate troops in the valley. In 3 days, Imboden's men inflicted more than 150 casualties on Sigel's cavalry and rendered 800 of these Union troops ineffective. Just 2 days before the battle, Imboden's men attacked Boyd's cavalry detachment near Newmarket. Imboden's troops tore Boyd's cavalry to pieces. 1 day later, Sigel made another mistake, his biggest blunder yet. As Breckinridge's army continued its march toward Newmarket, Sigel split his army. He ordered Colonel August Moore to take 1/3 of the infantry to test the strength of General Imboden's cavalry, which was now located a few miles north of Newmarket. Many of the men who rode south had not served in Moore's brigade before. Moore rode off without any maps. In short, he was handicapped from the start. As for the rest of the army, Sigel decided they would continue to march south first thing the next morning, May 15th, the morning of the battle. Breckinridge, meanwhile, had marched his troops from Harrisonburg to Lacey Spring, where he met that evening with General Imboden to plot strategy. Then Breckinridge wired General Braxton Bragg in Richmond. Bragg was a top military advisor to Jefferson Davis. Breckinridge let Bragg know that he was ready for battle.
If I meet the enemy, I will engage him.
poor New Market. It had seen skirmishes before. During the war, it had been occupied by both sides, but it had never borne the brunt of a full-scale battle. May 14th was a day of growing fear for residents there.
Can you help with us? Go ahead and get the hams and get those. We'll hide the hams.
Jessie Rupert put her thoughts on paper.
On Saturday, the 14th, the report that Imboden was retreating up the valley and the Yankees after him greatly excited the villagers.
James, do you need help?
Men hurried to leave town with horses and vehicles, and the women and children wept and repeated exaggerated stories of Yankee cruelty. Those who remained in their homes busied themselves in hiding whatever valuables they could gather. Every indication of extreme poverty was displayed. About sundown, the last of Imboden's men had passed through the streets, and those who remained of the citizens awaited with closed doors for the entrance of the approaching Yankees.
Hey, boys, over here.
Few of VMI's cadets slept that night. Their excitement was simply too great. Some of them took refuge in the old Mount Tabor church near Lacey Spring to get out of the rain, while others eyed the glow from distant campfires and wondered if they were fires of Union troops or those of fellow Confederate troops. Bev Stannard sat next to his campfire, wrapped in his blanket and wet from rain. Stannard thought about the letter he had written to his mother 2 nights before.
You're awful quiet tonight. Are you unwell, Jack?
Ever since we left the Institute, I've been wondering what's gonna happen tomorrow. I just can't stop thinking that I'm not gonna survive the fight.
Jack, you're not gonna die. None of us are. Even if we do fight tomorrow, the General's not gonna put us into battle.
John, I have to ask you something. If I die, I want to be buried back home. And I want you to see that my things at the Institute are returned to my mother. Will you do that for me, John?
I swear I will.
Not long after midnight, Private Stannard heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. It was another one of General Breckinridge's couriers. Orders were coming down the chain of command for the troops to move.
Sir, General Wharton has ordered the cadets to march north. They should start at 1:30.
Is that all, Private?
Yes, sir.
Give my regards to General Wharton.
Yes, sir.
The 19-year-old rolled up his blanket. He put on his kepi and gathered his gear. The cadets quietly assembled on the valley pike. At 1:30 a.m., the nearly 250 members of the Corps of Cadets took their places in the marching column.
Shoulder arms!
No ribbing, no laughter,
At route step, forward, march!
no levity. As the cadets marched quietly toward Newmarket, Private Stannard and Corporal Wise listened to the distant thunder and heard the sound of shoes striking the hard-surfaced valley pike. As dawn broke, only a few miles separated Colonel Shipp's cadets from Newmarket. 1 year ago, Jackson had been buried in Lexington. May 15th, 1864, would be a fateful day. What would it bring? Who would live and who would die? Who would control the valley? Although some of his troops had already arrived in Newmarket, Sigel began marching the bulk of his men south shortly before dawn. Newmarket was 18 miles away. Thick, dark clouds loomed overhead. Warm, moist air covered the valley. Massanutten Mountain peered in from the background. Breckinridge prepared his troops for battle. The general initially positioned his men on Williamson's Hill, 2 miles south of Newmarket, while Imboden's troops were positioned slightly to the north on Shirley's Hill. General Breckinridge had Imboden move forward and attack Sigel's troops, then feign a retreat, hoping to draw the Union troops into attacking. But the Federals refused to take the bait. Breckinridge began an artillery duel with the Federal troops who were located in the center of Newmarket.
Fire!
He surveyed the battlefield in front of him and told Imboden about his plan.
We can attack and whip them here, and I'll do it.
Not long after 10 a.m., as Confederate troops began forming their lines on Shirley's Hill, Breckinridge told Colonel Shipp the cadets would stay in reserve behind Virginia's 26th Battalion. He didn't want to expose the boys to enemy fire, but he told Shipp that he would put the cadets in if he had to. Corporal Wise and Private Stannard were told to guard a baggage wagon well behind Confederate lines, with orders to abandon it if the Federals pushed the Confederates back. But the orders didn't sit well with the 17-year-old whose father was not only a Virginia governor, but also a Confederate general.
I like fighting no better than anybody else, but I have an enemy in my rear as dreadful as any before us. If I should return home and tell my father that I was on the baggage guard while the cadets were in battle, he'd kill me with something worse than bullets. Ridicule. I intend to join the command at once.
The corporal looked at his fellow cadets, then rushed off toward the battlefield. Stannard hesitated for a moment, then did the same. Moments later, the two boys split up and joined their respective companies. Sigel, meanwhile, still had many miles to ride before he reached the battlefield. He arrived at Mount Jackson 7 miles north of Newmarket sometime after 10 o'clock that morning. Soon afterward, his troops marched over a bridge that spanned the Shenandoah River. Colonel Strother pondered Sigel's forward movement and worried about a trap. What if the Confederates got behind Sigel's men and then burned the bridge? Where would the Federals go? How would they escape? Sigel would make many blunders during this part of the campaign. He made a terrible one now, instructing 2 of his infantry regiments to remain in the area around Mount Jackson. The infantry advance of Confederate soldiers started around 11 a.m. After marching and waiting on the pike for probably 10 hours, Private Jefferson and his classmates now took their places in the battle line.
We'll be safe in here.
By this time, the Bushong family had taken refuge in their cellar.
Come on, Harrison, come on. I'm coming.
Anderson and his wife Elizabeth comforted their 2 children, while Sarah read from her Bible.
I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters.
Jacob thought about the destruction that was about to happen outside the window above his family. He also thought about all the work it took his father to establish the farm decades earlier.
Advance around!
The Corps of Cadets then descended the north slope of Shirley's Hill. Unlike other troops, they weren't told to run down the hill, so they marched as if they were on dress parade. They paid dearly for the mistake. Some of the cadets, including Corporal Wise, were wounded by artillery fire. Fortunately, the 17-year-old wasn't seriously hurt. The exploding shells created gaps in the VMI ranks, but the cadets closed up and kept moving forward. It was now noon. The Confederates had taken control of New Market. The hottest part of the battle would soon begin.
Ready? Fire!
General Imboden took his cavalry across Smith's Creek, hoping to get behind the Union force, burn the bridge across the Shenandoah River, and cut off the Federal line of retreat. The Federals, meanwhile, fell back, trying to strengthen their position. They withdrew from the town of New Market and reformed their lines in a wheat field on Jacob Bushong's property, just to the north of Bushong's home. Sigel's line filled the neck of land between Shenandoah River and Smith's Creek. From the strength of this new position, the Federals then began to pound the advancing Confederates. The situation all along Breckinridge's line looked grim.
Fire!
And nowhere more so than in the middle of the line, where the 51st and 62nd Virginia regiments joined. Breckinridge's ordnance officer suggested he put in the cadets. Breckinridge opposed the idea at first, but soon it looked as though he had no other choice. "Put the boys in," he said, "and may God forgive me for the order."
Fire!
The ordnance officer directed the cadets toward the gap which lay almost directly in front of them. A Union shell exploded, killing 3 cadets at once: William Cabell, Henry Jones, and Charles Crockett. 17-year-old William McDowell fell dead. A Union bullet pierced his heart. At the Bushong house, the cadets divided in half. 2 companies passed the house on the east, the other 2 on the west. They moved forward into the Bushong orchard directly in front of Union soldiers, the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, and 3 batteries of U.S. artillery.
Fire!
The cadets' commander, Scott Shipp, got a shell fragment in the shoulder and went down. Thomas Jefferson fell, with a wound to his chest, but told his comrades to move forward.
Go on! Go! Go! Go!
Jack Stannard fell with a terrible leg wound.
Go! Go!
The cadets ran forward and lay down on the north side of the Bushong's orchard behind a wooden fence. Here, for the first time, they began to fire on the enemy. Here, in the fatal orchard, Joseph Wheelwright fell. So did Luther Haynes and Samuel Atwill. To the left of the cadets, the 51st Virginia faltered but quickly rallied. The left flank of the 62nd fell back shattered. One company of Confederates, Woodson's Missourians, lost more than 3/4 of its men. At this point, it wasn't clear which army would give way first. Off to the east, Sigel's cavalry began to charge, but the Confederate artillery broke it and sent the horsemen back to the rear. Then the regiment, just to the left of the cadets, succeeded in turning the Union right flank. Sigel ordered his infantry to charge. The blue line of men from West Virginia and Massachusetts started across the wheat field. The 34th Massachusetts Regiment would get to within yards of the waiting Confederate line, but in the confusion, the Union attack fell apart. The 62nd Virginia crashed into the 54th Pennsylvania Regiment, which had just arrived on the field. Then it was the Confederates' turn. Victory was before them. When the order came to charge, the Confederate line moved in a wave of forward motion. the front line of the VMI ranks, 17-year-old Edward Tutwiler charged. So did 16-year-old Robert Cabell and 15-year-old John Roan. "6'2" Oliver Evans moved forward and held VMI's colors high.
Fire!
Sigel by now was agitated and began shouting his commands in German. As the boys advanced across the battlefield, many of them lost their shoes in the mud. Jacob Bushong's fertile wheat field now had a new name. A name that would spread across Virginia, the Field of Lost Shoes. In front of the cadets stood a battery of Union guns. By now, the Yankees had broken. They were running to the rear. The cadets captured a battle prize. A 12-pound gun and caisson. It was one of von Kleiser's guns of the 30th Battery, New York. With victory secured, Breckinridge took the cadets out of the battle. "Well done, Virginians," he said. "Well done, men." After the Confederates' cheers of victory died down, they were replaced by the groans of wounded and dying.
In this mask here, we're gonna have to hold it on to him.
Every large building around Newmarket became a hospital. Surgeons went to work inside the Bushong's house and inside their barn.
All right, take a deep breath for him.
Soldiers were treated at the Smith Creek Baptist Church.
He's gonna be fine. We're gonna try.
The surgeons began removing bullets, dressing wounds, and amputating fingers, arms, and legs.
Just a while.
The situation on the Union side was especially frightening. Their surgeons were forced to flee as they worked on their men. Several days later, Alexander Neal wrote about the moment in one of his letters.
Dear friends, we had the most terrible battle on Sunday at Newmarket.
Get that tourniquet around there.
Our army was literally routed and defeated.
Gonna have to go through.
We brought away some 200 or 300 of our wounded, filled 3 hospital buildings in Mount Jackson, and worked hard with them, with many mortally wounded dying in our hands.
Fortunately for Neal, however, Union artillerymen covered the retreat. But the Federals were in chaos. They might have been annihilated if it weren't for the discipline of one man, Captain Henry DuPont.
Section from the right!
Acting on his own initiative, DuPont began leapfrogging his artillery, firing each gun, then moving it to the rear. The move caused Breckinridge to briefly halt his pursuit and gave Sigel's troops the time they needed to cross the river and secure their escape by burning the bridge behind them. Sigel estimated his losses at nearly 100 dead, more than 500 wounded, and many horses, guns, and men captured. The Confederates' losses were also substantial, but the valley was safe, at least for now. As for the cadets, 5 of them lay dead. Nearly 50 were wounded, many seriously. Soon after the battle, those cadets who escaped injury returned to the battlefield looking for their wounded friends. Robert Cabell found his 18-year-old brother William dead, his head split open. John Wise found his roommate, Bev Stannard, lying on the porch of the Bushong house. Stannard had bled to death from his leg wound, even though another cadet had given him a canteen strap to use as a tourniquet. Moses Ezekiel went back to the battlefield looking for his friend Thomas Jefferson. Ezekiel found him lying on the floor of a nearby hut, severely wounded in the chest. Ezekiel had lost his shoes, but he walked barefoot into town to retrieve a wagon. After he returned, he brought Jefferson to the home of Liddy Kleindienst, a resident of Newmarket.
This way.
When Ezekiel laid Jefferson on top of the bed, Jefferson looked at his new friend, Liddy, and said, "Sister, what a good, soft bed." The morning after the battle, the rain had stopped, but the air was moist and dreary. Robert Madison, VMI's surgeon, worked on the wounded all day without stopping. So did George Ross, his assistant. In the afternoon, the cadets assembled at the cemetery of St. Matthew's Church to say goodbye to their fallen comrades. Jack Stannard, William Cabell, William McDowell, Charles Crockett, and Henry Jones. Robert Cabell grew misty-eyed as he remembered his fallen brother. So did Carrington Taylor and John Wise. Meanwhile, Ezekiel and Liddy Kleindienst were still tending to Jefferson. By May 16th, with his men back at Cedar Creek, Sigel wrote a letter to his superiors. It was the second one he had written to them since the battle. In it, he exaggerated the size and strength of his enemy and wrote that his men remained in good spirits. Meanwhile, his colonel, David Strother, penned another entry in his diary.
This campaign was miserably conducted by Sigel. I had hoped when he took over the department that he was at least honest and enthusiastic, but I now think he is an adventurer, a speculator, venal, and intriguing.
When General Grant learned of Sigel's defeat, he was furious. He, his chief of staff, and Lincoln's Secretary of War all agreed that Sigel must be replaced. Grant chose Major General David Hunter, a West Point graduate and a strict abolitionist. 1 week after the Battle of Newmarket, Hunter assumed command of Sigel's army.
Hold on. Thomas.
In Newmarket, meanwhile, Jefferson had held on for 2 days despite his severe chest wound.
Can you read to me from the New Testament? John 14.
Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. And whither I go ye know, and the way ye know.
Jefferson was losing his eyesight by this time, and he became delirious. At first, he thought Ezekiel was his mother, then his sister. Then he cried out for someone to light a candle. Ezekiel took Jefferson in his arms and held him as the 17-year-old took his final breaths. For 2 days, the dutiful Ezekiel had remained by Jefferson's side. The 19-year-old now washed Jefferson's body so the boy could be buried properly. He took a lock of Jefferson's hair to deliver to his parents. On the morning after Jefferson's death,
Fall in!
Colonel Shipp and his cadets, having buried their dead, were ordered to Richmond.
Arms!
News of the battle had spread. It stirred Virginia. The cadets were becoming heroes. On May 24th, President Jefferson Davis and Virginia's governor, William Smith, reviewed the Corps of Cadets in Richmond. The boys were given a new flag to replace their bullet-ridden banner, and the Confederate Congress unanimously passed a resolution commending them for their valor. John Wise and his classmates felt enormous pride mixed with their grief. For the families of the fallen cadets, the emotions ran even deeper. By now, VMI had begun notifying them about the battle. On May 18th, 3 days after the battle, the Institute sent a letter to Charlotte, North Carolina, to the brother of Private Henry Jones.
Sir, the superintendent has directed me to inform you that on May 10th, the Corps of Cadets was instructed to aid General Breckinridge's army in defense of the valley. I regret to inform you that your brother, Henry Jenner Jones, was killed in battle at Newmarket on May 15th. Your providence has ordained these young men be sent off in early youth. They fell fighting in a noble cause, in which all Southern youths are willing to pour out their heart's blood.
VMI also sent a letter of condolence to Iredell County, North Carolina, to the parents of 17-year-old William McDowell. Later that summer, the cadet's mother, Rebecca McDowell, wrote about her grief to one of her relatives.
My dear aunt, I had been intending to write to you, but it felt so badly that I put it off, hoping that my heavy sorrow would grow lighter. Unfortunately, as the days go by, I find it only deepens as I reflect on it and realize my loss. I felt so thankful that the poor dear child was not wounded and taken prisoner by our cruel foes, that he did not linger in agony, and that as he had to die, he died in the discharge of his duty to his God and country, and not a craven coward.
In the weeks following the battle, 4 more cadets would die as a result of their wounds. Joseph Wheelwright, Luther Haynes, Alva Hartsfield, and Samuel Atwill. For the families of the 10 fallen cadets, the summer of 1864 was a season of mourning. Given the rising death toll, so it was for thousands of other families in the Union and Confederacy. Every day, newspapers everywhere had a new list of casualties. In Lexington, Francis Smith and his faculty at VMI dealt with a special sort of grief, all their own. Not only the loss of 10 of their cadets, but the destruction of the Institute itself. On May 26th, 11 days after the Battle of Newmarket, General Hunter began to march south with orders to destroy the railroad centers at Staunton and Charlottesville. Hunter had fresh reinforcements. By now, his troops were rested. On June 5th, Hunter defeated Confederate troops in the Shenandoah Valley at the town of Piedmont. The next day, his men occupied Staunton with little difficulty. But Hunter was unable to reach Charlottesville because of Confederate fortifications in the mountains between the two cities. So he decided to move on Lynchburg. The maneuver took him through Lexington, where for 2 days he shelled VMI, and then burned the school. Hunter's men not only burned the barracks, they also destroyed VMI's hospital, the VMI library, and the school's laboratories. They even carted off VMI's beloved statue of George Washington. John Wise and his classmates had returned to the Institute by this time, but they were powerless to prevent Hunter's destruction. Instead, they evacuated VMI and withdrew to Lynchburg. It would be a month before they returned. When they did, they found their barracks in ruins. In September, the cadets set up classes in Richmond where they stayed for the duration of the war, helping to protect the city against a federal invasion. This is the kind of destruction they saw the following spring as the rebellion crumbled. Following the war, VMI once again opened its doors, although little was left of the school other than its reputation. Like the rest of Virginia, the Institute turned to the task of rebuilding. Cadets trickled back. War-torn buildings were replaced. For 5 years, faculty members worked at a fraction of their former pay. As for the Newmarket Cadets, after the war, their legacy continued to grow. In May 1866, a detail of cadets traveled to Newmarket and escorted the remains of the 5 cadets who were buried there back to Lexington. Following the war, Franz Sigel resigned his commission and moved to Baltimore and later New York, where he was active in politics and business. He died in 1902. John C. Breckinridge fled the country when the war ended. After his success in the Valley, he became the Confederacy's Secretary of War. He ultimately returned to his home state of Kentucky. In 1875, he died at age 54. Henry DuPont, whose performance at Newmarket prevented Sigel's annihilation, received a Medal of Honor for his bravery during the Civil War. Nearly 50 years later, as a United States Senator from Delaware, he passed legislation to reimburse VMI for the destruction General Hunter caused several weeks after the battle. The Bushongs continued to farm their land. They rebuilt their lives just as countless other families did in Virginia. Liddy Kleindienst married and became Liddy Krim. Over the years, she strengthened her ties to VMI and ultimately earned the nickname Mother of the Newmarket Cadets. The person who gained the greatest fame, however, was the 19-year-old cadet who held the dying Thomas Jefferson in his arms, Moses Ezekiel. Following the Battle of Newmarket, Ezekiel was promoted to Sergeant of Company C. He graduated from VMI in 1866 and returned to Richmond. And then, at the encouragement of Robert E. Lee, he traveled to Cincinnati to study art. In 1869, he sailed to Europe. Gradually, he became a world-famous sculptor, ultimately settling in Rome, where he set up his studio. As the 20th century dawned, Ezekiel's work was so impressive, he was knighted by the King of Italy. During his adulthood, Sir Moses created nearly 200 works of art, many of which are still on display in the United States and Europe. His works include Edgar Allan Poe in my hometown of Baltimore, Thomas Jefferson at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia, and Virginia mourning her dead at VMI in Lexington, which continues to stand guard over the fallen cadets.
For a VHS copy of the program you've just seen, please send $24.95 to WVPT or contact us for information on how to pay by credit card.